We're just going to wait for people to filter in, and then we'll start the webinar. Okay, we seem to have a reasonable audience. Hello, my name's Nick Mabey. I'm the co-CEO and founding director of E3G, and welcome to our webinar this afternoon on COP27. What happened, but perhaps even more importantly, what happens next? We have a packed lineup of experts who will introduce and decipher what happened at COP27, a COP that's resulted in many very mixed comments about mixed elements. So I think one that really does need deciphering going forward. So the way we're going to run this press conference is I'm going to give some very brief contextual remarks, and I'm going to pass over to Alden Meyer, who's a senior associate, who will give a broad overview. Then Alex Scott, who was leading our team on the ground in Sharm El Sheikh, will go more deeply into areas like loss and damage and some of the textual issues. And then drawing back a bit, some of the big issues discussed, Kate Levick, who leads our sustainable finance work, will talk through both what happened inside and outside the negotiating halls, and Camilla Fenning, who works on our energy transitions work, will do something similar around the energy work. We'll then, after these very brief introductions, move into a Q&A. Please use the Q&A function in order to send questions in, and then we will try and wrap up within a kind of 50-minute slot. So that's the basic structure. So, and just to remind ourselves, going into COP27, people had pretty low expectations. We had an energy, food, and debt crisis distracting leaders from this area. We had toxic geopolitics, US and China who weren't even talking about climate change because fights over Taiwan. Many commentators were predicting kind of no agreement at the G20, which was going to be happening at the same time, and distraction and drift at COP27. So it was one of the least auspicious environments for a COP we'd ever seen. As it turned out, at the G20, mostly the line was held on what was achieved at Glasgow, and there was actually an outcome, including a decarbonisation plan for Indonesia, which was actually a real step forward and built on the South Africa plan from last year. The US and China had perhaps what's best called a détente moment on climate change, which actually released quite a lot of conversations and moving forward and protected climate from the worst geopolitics. And COP27 did deliver some progress in some areas, but not enough for 1.5 degrees, obviously, and with much unfinished business for next year. So we'll now turn over what was delivered, who stepped up, who stepped back.
Okay, I think Nick is frozen, so I think I'll just step in. I assume he was about to turn it over to me. This is Alden Meyer, Senior Associate. Let me just give you some of the highlights and lowlights of what happened. Clearly, the biggest highlight was the agreement on loss and damage to establish a fund, and for the first time in 30 years, to start ramping up serious assistance to developing countries who are suffering the frontline impacts of climate change. This was a very tough fight. I think the keys to getting it were the unity of the G77 in China, and then some of the movements late in the 2 weeks by New Zealand, Canada, EU, and others, leaving the US totally isolated to the point where it had to agree on a fund. It had been trying to block coming in to the COP, but of course this is only beginning, and Alex will talk in a minute about what comes next to actually stand up the fund, figure out where it fits in the broader architecture of international channels and vehicles for funding, and most importantly, identify how to fund it. A fund without funds is not very useful. And one of the big fights that we saw in the last 2 weeks was the issue of the contributor base. The US, the EU, others calling for countries like China, the Saudis, Singapore, Kuwait, et cetera, to step up and provide funding. That's not going to go away. That's going to be a huge fight, not just on loss and damage, but on broader climate finance going forward. On mitigation, on the other hand, I'd have to say the outcome was very weak. It reiterated the Glasgow language on keeping 1.5 alive, on phasing down coal, on phasing out fossil fuel subsidies. India proposed that we expand fossil fuel phase down to include oil and gas. Over 80 countries from both developed and developing areas supported that, but it was blocked by the Saudis, Russians, Chinese, Iran, and Brazil in particular, and aided by the Egyptian presidency, which worked overtime to keep this language out of the final agreement. And actually, the way they played this was they had the COP approve the loss and damage decision before taking up the broader cover text, which included the mitigation elements. So for countries that wanted progress on 1.5, the only way they could have opened that up on the floor in the last hours was to overturn the decision they had just made on loss and damage, which of course was not viable. I think you have to say here that Egypt put precedence on its national interests as a gas producer and ally of Saudi Arabia and others over its role as an honest broker in the presidency. And we're going to need to see if we can get the UAE to take a different approach next year, because I think this issue is clearly teed up to take momentum on, and it will help that India holds the chairmanship of the G20 next year and can try to raise that in that forum. On finance, we didn't see much on the pathway to doubling adaptation finance from $20 to $40 billion by 2025, the commitment that was made by developed countries in Glasgow last year. We didn't see much progress on how the developed countries will deliver the 100 billion. On the post-2025 finance, this was only a sort of road stop on way to making a decision on that in 2024. But we saw storm clouds gathering, particularly over this issue of expanding the donor base to include China and others. But we did get very good hooks in the language on the role that the multilateral development banks, such as the World Bank, need to play. We got some reference and certainly some very powerful speeches by Mia Mottley and others on needing to deal with the overall climate and development finance agenda, including debt relief for developing countries. And President Macron agreed to work with Mia Mottley and others to tee this up at a summit in June next year. And this will also come up at the World Bank and IMF spring meetings. And I'm sure Kate will say more about this in a moment. On adaptation, there wasn't the progress that we needed to see on the global goal. This still remains a fraught space. And so Alex will talk a little bit about what comes next there. But clearly the victory on loss and damage didn't deal with the concern about the need to ramp up adaptation finance as well and resilience investments. And finally, on agriculture, both developed and developing countries blocked the drive to get into food systems reform to really address the potential of agriculture and food to contribute to solutions on climate change, really, rather than being about a quarter of the problem. Maybe just a couple of other things. Of course, last year, the whole focus was keeping 1.5C alive. I remember back then, Alok Sharma and others said that it really was in critical care in the intensive care unit. Clearly, we have not made progress on that front. I think if we were honest, we'd have to say it's moving from critical care towards hospice care. At this point, there's already been some statements in media, including by Laurence Toubiana, one of the architects of Paris, that 1.5 is increasingly out of reach. It may be technically and scientifically feasible, but given the politics, it's not in prospect. So that's something that we're going to have to come back to this next year in the run-up to UAE, and also looking at other fora, because of course the power of the blockers, the petrostates and others, to block progress in this UNFCCC space means we may not be able to expect much progress on that. Final comment I'll make is on the process here, which was really truly flawed. I've been to most of the COPs over the last decades, and this presidency really was not running a fair and transparent process. Just give you one example. On Friday night or Saturday morning, I forget which, the presidency called in representatives of countries to show them draft text on the major issues. So Frans Timmermans from the EU was invited in to represent all 27 member states, had 15 minutes to look over text, wasn't given the language, wasn't given the text, wasn't even allowed to take pictures of the relevant part, and then had to go back and explain to the EU what he had seen. So this is no way to run a transparent and open process. Hopefully the UAE will do a better job next year in really engaging parties and building the support we need, not just to implement the loss and damage finance piece, but to move forward on mitigation on other fronts. So I'll leave it there, Nick.
Great, thanks, Alden. A great overview. Alex, loss and damage was obviously the big highlight of the conference. What happened and where are we going on that and some of the other core issues?
Sure, and I think what we really saw over the 2 and a bit weeks of COP27 was AOSIS, the Alliance of Small Island States, really playing a major outsized role compared to their size in the talks, in bringing together the unity of the Group of 77 and China developing countries to keep that loss and damage issue top of mind, top of the agenda, and not backing down from the position that they'd taken in. And that saw them playing a key role in the summit. That was Antigua and Barbuda leading AOSIS at the COP. And I think we also saw a key role coming from Barbados. Alden mentioned Mia Motley's speeches and Bridgetown agenda around broader finance system reforms, and you can see that peppered throughout the COP27 outcome in that loss and damage decision, which does create a fund, creates a process to define that fund and some of the sticking issues around who pays into it and who gets to access it, and what other kind of sources of finance could be sought for that loss and damage fund. But that loss and damage decision also looks to the role of the international finance institutions in helping to address loss and damage and secure countries' liquidity when crises hit, looking at things like debt service suspension clauses in sovereign debt instruments, so that when a country is hit by a huge climate disaster, they can take 2 years of pausing their debt repayments, 2 to 3 years of pausing their debt repayments, and use that spare liquidity to deal with the immediate crisis at hand. And some of these ideas around the broader finance system's role really came from Barbados and driving them through the AOSIS group and keeping that G77 group together. The other key player in bridging to this loss and damage outcome was Germany and Chile as the co-facilitators of this question in the UN climate talks. And I think Germany we saw playing a big bridge building role on this issue, particularly because of the change in politics in Germany around the issue of loss and damage, partly due to the change in government, but also because of the experience of Germany of the last couple of years with huge floods that have required big compensation payouts, really bringing home the issue of loss and damage to them. The other way that we ended up with this historic loss and damage outcome, I think, was with New Zealand and Canada coming out quite early at the end of the second week, being flexible about the idea of agreeing to a fund that helped to bridge some space for the EU to come in with a compromise, a package proposal that they put forward to agree to a loss and damage fund alongside some of the key outcomes they were looking for on mitigation. But that EU move, while it came late in the process, it really isolated the US and kind of helped bring together the outcome that we saw on loss and damage as a whole. What we didn't see, as Alden mentioned, was a huge step forward on the emissions cuts, on the mitigation agenda at COP. And there are a couple of reasons behind this. Firstly, I think we didn't see a really clear vision for the role of this COP, other than the rhetoric of it being an implementation COP. We didn't see a vision coming together. That's partly down to the role of the presidency, but also we didn't see the North-South High Ambition Coalition that typically plays a role in shepherding the kind of overall vision for the UNFCCC process coming together. That was stymied by the disagreement over the loss and damage issue. We saw other high ambition coalitions like the Cartagena Dialogue is another one of those groupings of developed and developing countries focused on high ambition. They did come together, they defined the vision for the mitigation work program that was agreed through the COP, but at the political level, they couldn't come together in that high ambition grouping until the very last hours, really, of the conference, once the compromise on the loss and damage fund had been made. And without that strong high ambition political force there wasn't the kind of consensus push to overcome the inertia from the likes of the Arab group and the like-minded developing country group, particularly Saudi Arabia, as Alden mentioned. I think what we did see come out on mitigation was around preserving what happened in Glasgow, but also really clarifying that there's global consensus on seeing climate action as one of the routes to dealing with the multiple crises that we're facing at the moment that Nick mentioned at the beginning of this meeting. And I think that came down to what we got from the G20 in the beginning of the second week of the COP. We saw them holding the line on Glasgow, but also really showcasing how climate was the route to address these other crises. And that helped bring together the coalition that was going to push for the fossil fuel phase out, which I'm sure Camilla will pick up next. I'll leave it there, Nick.
Great, thanks. And it shows that the dynamics are getting quite difficult, but interesting. Turning to Kate now, it was only in 2015 that we first saw at Paris the mention of multilateral development banks, of private finance, of financial regulation, even around the COP, let alone the COP. But it played a really big role in the room and in the text in this meeting. What's changed and how much progress have we made, and what's kind of suddenly it seems center stage as opposed to being a peripheral issue in the COP discussions?
Yeah, thanks, Nick. So yes, this was much more of a central issue. So COP27 really built on the mood of the G20 and on the momentum that was around the Bridgetown initiative, and the COP countries collectively recognised the need for transformation of the financial system in order to finance the transition and resilience needs of developing countries. That's really reflected in the final text. And that was championed by European countries throughout, but actually supported by a number of key developing country coalitions as well. It's not something that COP can do from the COP process itself, but marking this in the COP text really creates that space for forward discussion with a wider group of countries than, for example, has access to the G20, and it chimes with the kind of moves and developments that we're seeing in other forums. So that was a really framing development for COP. It's been alluded to a couple of times already, and the reason was it cuts across a number of issues. As Alden said, there was very little actual new money on the table in Egypt, and there was less momentum than hopeful for doubling adaptation finance. And it was also noted in that final COP text that global climate finance for 2019-20 is only sort of 32% of the annual investment needed. And one of the key things that parties asked for to help deal with that is a lot of reforms from the multilateral development banks, the MDBs. And we can expect to hear a lot more about those at the IMF spring meetings, and then also potentially at the Macron summit that has been announced for mid-year next year. And then, as has been discussed, the landmark agreement on loss and damage still leaves unresolved some pretty key questions over who benefits and who pays, and the success of the talks altogether was called into question by the tensions over those issues. That was a significant factor in what brought the deadline so late over the line. The COP also noted the role of the private sector in financial system reform, both in the context of that financial system change, but also in the context of private sector accountability for net pledges and for delivery. And that integrity does remain a key area of concern, as it was at COP26. We saw the UN Secretary General's high-level expert group come out with some strong recommendations on that front. But that sort of bringing the private sector in is echoed by the announcement of the Indonesia JETP, which came out during the COP, with 50% of the at least 20 billion package is actually set to come from the private sector from members of GFANZ. So that new broader framing may, over the next couple of years, shape the way that countries approach the new collective quantified goal, the climate finance goal for after 2025. And we are likely to see further activity over the next year to take forward discussion of Article 2.1c, which is the Paris goal of aligning all financial flows with climate action, which is much broader than the climate finance discussions alone. So I talked about the UN Secretary General's high-level expert group. The final recommendation that group made was to create an international task force of regulators. It's unclear yet how exactly that will land, given we have a number of international groupings of regulators already. But that recommendation really does demonstrate the strong momentum behind sort of an international pivot to regulation that we saw coming through at this COP. That was more of the around rather than within, but it was very clearly demonstrated. It's a move away from purely voluntary actions in the private sphere, as we've seen through the non-state action agenda created at Paris, and a move towards parties through their regulators actually taking this on and enforcing it. So in that sense, the private sector is in the process of moving closer to the inside of the COP process under the supervision of parties. And it would be remiss of me not to note that one of the things that helped create that story at COP was the launch of the UK's Transition Plan Task Force outputs for consultation. So the UK announced at COP26 that it would require private firms and listed companies and financial firms to publish climate transition plans. That Transition Plan Task Force, which E3G co-leads the Secretariat, put out for consultation at COP27 exactly what that looked like. So helping to show that this regulation was happening and that this was a delivery COP.
Right, thanks so much, Kate. So if we had progress on loss and damage, we had progress on financing, if not on finance itself in terms of money. But Camilla, finally, to you quickly, we didn't have progress on fossil fuels, really. What was the story about the energy transition in the COP, or was it better around the COP than in the COP this year?
Sure, thanks, Nick. Well, I mean, we were forewarned that the COP27 presidency didn't want to talk about coal at all. And obviously that was a complete change from the COP26 tagline of consigning coal to history. So a very different feel. As you, Nick, and Alden have mentioned, that there were the sort of battle lines hardening over the urgency of phasing out of fossil fuels, particularly in the current sort of short-term energy squeeze. But the language on coal phase down was secured in the final moments at Glasgow. So that was around accelerating efforts towards the phase down of unabated coal and phase out of inefficient fuel subsidies. That paragraph was a complete cut and paste of the Glasgow Climate Pact. And clearly cutting and pasting is not really a recipe for implementation or any type of momentum. So, that's disappointing. Having said that, we now do have those sort of 80 countries that were calling for the phase down of all fossil fuels. So that's a way forward. There were some positive additions, I think, in the text. There were a number of references to renewable energy, and I'm surprised that actually renewable energy has not been mentioned since COP21, apparently. It certainly wasn't mentioned in the Glasgow Climate Pact, and referring to renewable energy as the key to the solution to the energy and climate crises. Kate's mentioned the JETPs, and I think the sort of G20 language on that, and then obviously the Indonesia JETP being announced was helpful in this context. And I think that sort of provided a real world example of how this coal to clean energy transition is going to play out. There was also a line on renewable energy needing $4 billion investment per year by 2030 to reach net zero by 2050. So again, looking forward for how sort of practically one can kind of make all this happen. There wasn't much around energy efficiency or small scale renewables. There wasn't a peak demand target. There wasn't enough on energy access, for example. So lots of pieces that could have been added to the text, which weren't, which is disappointing. So, the best we've got is the integrity of the Glasgow language, inching further on renewables, and with some signs of, the JETPs being a way that we can kind of push forward, particularly using the lessons from the JETP to push forward MDB reform, which we've already talked about in this session. Thanks.
Great, thanks very much. So I'm now moving to questions and answers. Can you use the Q&A or put your hand up and we'll unmute you and you can ask a question verbally. We have the first question from Petra Pinsler on China. And I'll start and then hand this over to Alden perhaps. So I think China came to this COP not wanting to be the story. It had been a bit too much the story in COP26. So most of what it did was behind the scenes. When challenged on contributing to loss and damage, it held its traditional line, but then mentioned it would be giving money to developing countries on loss and damage. We know that behind the scenes, it was quite tough on not recognizing debt issues and not being willing to to work with others on debt problems. That was a position it held at the G20. Still, so China was very much kind of supporting the G77 consensus on loss and damage, and making sure it wasn't taking any more commitments on mitigation, particularly in the mitigation program. So quite but effective this time round, but with some more perhaps theatrical flourishes in the G20. Alden, US-China, that was the other thing that happened or didn't quite happen.
Yeah, well, first, a couple of bits on China's role in the negotiations. As you say, China really tried to stay below the radar screen and not be the one taking flack for slowing down progress, but it was working assiduously behind the scenes. Two examples on the mitigation work program, which we didn't really discuss in our opening remarks, but was an outcome from this process. China worked to try to slow that down, to really make sure it didn't result on any additional pressure on countries like itself to do more on mitigation. They originally tried to turn that into a one-year nothing burger work program. They had to compromise and let it go for 4 more years and then review what happens next. But it's not what it should have been. The other thing, of course, is that China, as I said, worked with the Saudis, Iran, Russia, Brazil, and others to block the effort to expand the fossil fuel phase down language from coal to oil and natural gas. Interesting, because China is not an oil and gas producer, and also putting themselves at odds with India, which is interesting geopolitically. So that's something to try to unpack. Finally, we did get agreement to renew the US-China Climate Working Group that was launched in Glasgow after Presidents Biden and Xi had their bilateral on Monday of the second week. Minister Shea and Special Envoy Kerry were meeting frequently, even before that bilateral and especially afterwards, to stand up and re-engage on the mitigation elements of that, including methane and phase down of domestic coal. But of course, it's too early to tell what that will actually result in. And so pressure on China to step up on mitigation and not blocking progress in the UNFCCC is going to be critical in the year ahead.
Excellent, thanks very much. So Megan Rowling had a question, if you can be unmuted and ask that. Megan, you can go ahead.
Yes, hi, sorry, just took a second to unmute there, sorry. Yes, I'm interested in another aspect which I missed the start, but I don't think you've discussed it yet. The new work programme that was agreed on, or set in motion on just transition. I was just wondering if you could give me some more details of what the negotiations did on that and sort of how they got to that point, and whether there's any controversy around that, you know, what sort of things you think the work programme is going to be tackling and what the process is going to be, and also whether there was any discussion at COP27 about finance for just transition, especially the just part of just energy transitions, because it often seems that that's kind of lip services paid to that, but we don't know really, you know, what it means and how we're going to get it. And then just, you know, also in terms of who is likely to benefit most from a just transition work programme under the UNFCCC. Thank you very much.
Looks like, Nick, I thought you were frozen again.
No. So I thought, Alden, can you answer the beginning of that, and then perhaps Camilla pick up the kind of J of the JETPs as, in more detail?
Sure. Well, thanks, Megan, for the question. And this was a bit of a mystery. It came in late to the game in the text. Egypt obviously put it in there. It's not clear who was behind it. Just transition is a key part of this process. There already is a work program on just transition coming out of the Katowice response measures track. So it's not clear how this dovetails over with that. And of course, it's not clear how it intersects with the mitigation work program, which includes just transition and provision of finance as key elements of that work program. So I think we've got more digging to do to find out exactly what this is meant to do to ensure that it's complementary to the existing Katowice work program on just transition, and it's not duplicative of what the mitigation work program is supposed to do. It does call for annual ministerial meetings, which could be useful because we have to make progress on just transition to unlock mitigation ambition. But again, we've got to figure out how this complements existing and some of the new tracks coming out of the mitigation work program to know exactly what it's going to mean.
Camilla, just on the
Thanks. Yeah, just to add just one point. I mean, I think the language around just transition in the documents, and also just the amount of discussion on just transition during the 2 weeks, shows that just transition has very much become something that's around the how, the coal to clean. It's all around the how rather than the if now. So and I think the fact that now that South Africa has published its investment plan, there was the Indonesia JETP. It sounds as if the Vietnamese one will come out potentially at the EU ASEAN summit on the 14th of December. All of these are kind of real world impacts. Obviously, the proof of the pudding is to make sure the money actually does flow. And obviously that sort of MDB reform will be important in that we can't just have those few JETPs. It needs to be available for sort of more of those countries. But I think their proof of concept has been underlined now as something that can be taken forward into 2023. Of course, who actually pays for the just bit is an important question, because the issue is around how many of the sort of the private investors are wanting to get the bits that can earn the money, and how do you cover the rest? So I think there's ongoing discussions on that. But I think it was positive that there was quite a lot of interest in the JETPs coming through, not only the G20 but also COP.
And I think, Megan, that's right. Even in Europe, where we've got quite a significant amount of money to help coal regions, both grants and loans, it's not just who puts the money in the J, it's can it actually get to the people impacted. It's not as easy as you think. So this is going to be one of the long running pieces alongside loss and damage. It's how do we make sure allocated money is the right type of money and actually gets the people who actually need it, as opposed to the people it's kind of easier to get to or can shout the loudest and have the most power anyway. And that's becoming more and more of a practical issue as we get into delivery and change. I'm going to go to Fiona Harvey next from The Guardian.
Hello, thank
Fiona,
you. Yes, thanks for holding this. I'd like to ask, we're obviously going to be having the next climate conference in UAE, very strongly pro fossil fuel state. What does that mean? We've seen, you've mentioned the fingerprints of Saudi Arabia and some of the countries over the decisions that were made at COP27. So what can we expect at COP28 from fossil fuel producers?
I'll start, and then perhaps I don't know if Alden or Alex want to take that one up, or both of them want to take it up. I think there is, UAE is not Egypt and is not Saudi. They're all very different, have very different interests, and want to position themselves in different ways. So I think, so the geopolitics of the presidency is one thing, and will be part not just about them having fossil fuels, but what they want to do with their fossil fuels and their future economic model. And UAE has said very different things about that, which hopefully means it's got a more balanced approach. Of course, fossil fuel producers are different to any individual, and they all have both competitive and cooperative goals. And that's one of the, I think, coming out of this conference in particular, understanding the dynamics between fossil fuel producers, who of course are riding a boom in fossil fuel price at the moment, and how they're engaging with the COP is definitely, in a way, they haven't been that powerful for the past few years. This was the biggest throw of strength, but we would expect to see some pushback from the fossil fuel consumers who are suffering at the moment against that. I don't know, Alex or Alden, who wants to go first on the on a more specific COP-based discussion?
I can come in quickly. I think we definitely saw a lot of lobbyists at COP27 and saw them kind of helping play a role in stymieing some of the push for stronger language on fossil fuel phase down. I think the UAE will have been watching some of the criticism that came for the Egyptian presidency at COP27 and be aware that they will be under intense scrutiny after the way that some of the elements of COP27 were handled. I think we've also seen Simon Steele, the new UNFCCC Executive Secretary, come out saying he recognises there's been some criticism of the process and the way things were handled over the recent COP, and wants to look at what some of the recommendations might be to improve the processes next year. So I think there's definitely a risk of the fossil fuel lobby coming in strong at COP28, but with the extra scrutiny that there will be on the UAE presidency, I think there's a good chance that that will be quite well managed for next year.
Yeah, let me just add to that. I mean, I think UAE is very aware of the criticism that Egypt took and will try to run a better process. It's hard to imagine running a worse process. I've been to most of the COPs, and this was perhaps the worst in terms of lack of transparency and organization and effectiveness. Two things, though. I mean, at the opening leaders segment, the king of UAE mentioned that they intended to be a fossil fuel producer, that they see a long-term role for oil and gas, so not much difference from Egypt there. But also, as far back as Glasgow, they indicated they wanted to use their presidency to advance decarbonization, innovation, technological development, et cetera. They are also host to the International Renewable Energy Association administration. So they have been a long-time leader on renewables and clean energy, even as they promote continued sales of oil and gas. So I think there are some things to hope for. And having resolved the loss and damage fight, although there's implementation details, of course, the real spotlight, I think, at the UAE COP is going to be on mitigation. And can we keep 1.5C alive? And the UAE is going to have to deal with that way, hopefully in a more neutral way than Egypt did.
Great. So going, just moving down the list, Will Worry from DevX had a question, Alex, on the kind of detail of the challenges, loss and damage that were kind of moved to next year on who pays. So what are the kind of the battles that were raised but not resolved at COP27?
Yeah, two big questions around the funding around loss and damage that were brought to the surface at this COP but weren't addressed. There are also two issues that have been underlying COP finance negotiations, climate finance discussions for a long time. And they are, firstly, what sources and which countries pay into the fund, looking at the supporter base that under the UN Climate Convention, the 1992 convention, was set up as the developed countries as the contributor base and the developing countries as the recipients of climate finance. And we saw over the discussions of loss and damage that Europe, the US in particular, were pushing back on that being the frame for thinking about the future of loss and damage financing, calling for a recognition that the world has moved on, that there's more dynamism in who needs and who could afford to pay into some of this financing. The kind of reaction from the G77 was definitely looking to kind of secure the original division of developed and developing countries, and that was a strong line coming from them. So this will be one of the big questions to be answered in the next year to 2 years of operationalizing this fund. Who is on the hook to pay into it? Are they on the hook in an obligation to pay into it? Are they on the hook as a voluntary invitation to contribute to the fund? But also what other sources could be looked at, including things like the UN Secretary General's proposal of a tax on windfall profits of fossil fuel companies, or the Marshall Islands proposal of a levy on international shipping and aviation as other potential sources. The second big question is about who is eligible to receive funds from a loss and damage fund. And that question is based partly in some critique of the way climate financing currently works, where a lot of it goes to large middle income or kind of middle income countries or lower middle income countries, rather than the least developed countries or even the small island developing states who have graduated and are no longer eligible for official development assistance. And this leaves a very small chunk going to those communities who really need the support for loss and damage. That is part of the motivation that the EU and US brought to wanting to focus this loss and damage fund on the most vulnerable countries. The other part of that battle is also how they convey to their citizens and taxpayers who their taxpayer dollars are going to. And I think this is going to be one of those big fault lines over the next couple of years that risks keeping that kind of stymieing of the North-South High Ambition Coalition from bringing what we need into COP28. There'll need to be a lot of work to resolve some of those differences to be able to bring that coalition back together.
Hey, one of the things that also was raised was that the developed countries talking about taking into account the mosaic of different financial solutions, including at the IMF and World Bank already paying out on loss and damage, as opposed to just focusing on a fund in inside the UNFCCC. How do you see those debates moving forward next year on the different fora, financial fora?
Sure. So I think this shows how we will see these developments playing out in a number of different fora and not only in the COP negotiations. So obviously this whole question of who is vulnerable plays very much into the sort of dialogue and developments that have been happening over the last year or two in terms of the IMF and how the IMF helps countries that are climate vulnerable and has been sort of updating and reforming its systems to be able to deal with that better, notably through the Resilience and Sustainability Trust. COP participants clearly also saw a role for the MDBs and loss and damage funding, and that brings a whole new layer of politics into the situation. The COP, of course, doesn't have direct control over the MDBs. Who has direct control over the MDBs is the MDB shareholders, which is actually quite a broad range of countries, depending on which MDB you're talking about. But of course, the biggest and most powerful shares are with those richer northern countries. But sometimes that can give countries a little bit of flexibility where it may not be so easy for them to allocate new bits of national budgets, but they may be able to do something through the MDB. So it both creates opportunities and adds complexity, and we will likely see that playing out through the IMF Springs next year, again, potentially in the Macron summit around sort of the Bridgetown Initiative and some of these bigger financial reforms.
Will,
a lot of questions.
Yeah, does that answer your question? I know you saw hands still up, or is that great? I assume that has then. Angeli Mehta has raised the issue, which I think I'll start with Alden, which is about the life support metaphor, where and the hospice. So how can the COP actually help countries meet their commitments and act on them and move forward? What is the plan for getting out of the hospice over the next couple of years as we move towards 2025, which is the next big point?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think there is some potential for the mitigation work program to aid in identifying barriers and making progress on sectoral decarbonization, which then can allow countries to increase the ambition of their national commitments. That remains to be seen. But as I've said before, because particularly of the Saudis blocking the rule of procedure on voting since the beginning of this process in Rio in 1992, decisions have to be made by consensus. There's no supermajority voting the way there is in other UN regimes. So it gives the Saudis and others incredible leverage to block things. So I think we do need to look outside the COP. I mentioned the G20. I think there is the potential for progress under India's presidency in the G20. Next year on this front, India is also hosting the Clean Energy Ministerial Mission Innovation Summit next year. And as opposed to Sharm El Sheikh, there was a fair amount of progress made on that at the Pittsburgh Global Clean Energy Action Forum in September to build on. I would also say keep your eye on some of the sectoral fora on heavy industries such as steel, forests, energy system transformation, vehicles and fuels, et cetera. I think that's where a lot of the action is, and we can make progress on that front. And of course, we have to look at progress at the national level. I've often said that the UNFCCC can't force anyone to do anything they don't think is in their national interest. It's obviously in countries' national interest to shift away from fossil fuels and go to cleaner and cheaper clean energy over the years and decades ahead. So I would keep an eye on the potential for additional JETPs. Beyond the countries that have announced them so far. I would think especially there's the potential for India to step up on implementation of its 500 gigawatt renewable energy commitment if it gets the financial support it needs from external partners. Clearly, the big unknown is China. Will China actually not just unveil its methane emissions reduction plan, but address its commitment with the US and Glasgow to start phasing down coal emissions in the second half of the 2020s? That's a key variable. And then finally, I'd say keep your eye on Brazil once Lula takes over. I think we're going to see renewed engagement by Brazil, both on the national level, particularly ramping up efforts to block additional deforestation and fully engaging its very talented diplomatic corps in multilateral diplomacy in a different way than Brazil has done under Bolsonaro.
Yeah, and it's a bit ironic that on a year where we saw, again, kind of 85 to 90% of investment in the power sector go into renewables, that we're struggling to get renewables into a text UNFCCC. China is doing the world's largest build out of renewables this year, and the US and Europe are fighting over who can give more subsidies to electric vehicles and renewable energy in hundreds of billions. So in the real economy, you know, and that was very true in Sharm, is the kind of real economy was moving and scaling and ramping up in ways that weren't reflected in the text, which was rather out of step with what's happening and where countries see their kind of economic interest if they don't export fossil fuels, which is obviously a very small minority of countries with not much of the world's population in it. There was one question from Mira Shah at Imperial on agriculture, which got bumped to things. I don't know if you want to, there was a discussion about how the agriculture conversations went and where that might go. I know, Alden, you were following that a bit, if you want to come in. And then does anybody want to pick up the other question from Tracy on embedded emissions? You can tell me in the chat if you want to pick that up. But Alden, agriculture.
Yeah, on agriculture, it was really our colleague Claire McConnell that was following in that in depth. So maybe we should refer you to her to get into the details. But as I said, that was a very fraught space. There was incredible tension in the room between developed and developing countries on that. There's been agreement to focus on adaptation and resilience for the agriculture sector to adapt to climate change and its effect on food security and yields and that kind of thing. But there's not agreement on how to address with the mitigation side of things. What's the potential for agriculture to be a solution rather than a contributor to emissions globally? And there's different reasons for that between developed and developing countries, but there was kind of a unified response to, we don't want to get into the discussion on fundamental food system reform going forward. So we may need to look for another space where that can happen. It's not my area. Maybe Claire has some suggestions, or others on the call might be, but it is representing, along with deforestation, about 25% of global emissions. So we can't avoid it forever.
Great, thanks. And I think, again, it shows that in agriculture, the battle lines are very different to a simple kind of north-south split across each of these issues. There are different coalitions and interests of countries, which often makes it every single issue is a complex, huge issue, and there's no kind of overarching piece. I think we're nearing the end. I'm not sure we have anything to offer on the Ukraine question. I'm sorry. And perhaps we could talk, Alden might, or Camilla might talk a bit about the how the response to the energy crisis undermined progress on fossil fuels. That was definitely a conversation, but I'll just pick up Tracy's point on embedded emissions. And I think if you look at the data, the difference, apart from the odd country like the UK, that's a bit of an outlier, between countries' consumption emissions and production emissions is actually drawing closer, as particularly China decarbonizes in per GDP, even if not absolute levels. And so kind of the production and consumption countries can start converging in emissions intensity. I think what's interesting is actually the alternative, where we're seeing particularly European industries worried about less country industries going abroad to dirty coal producers, but going abroad to cheap solar producers in North Africa. Egypt is definitely building a lot of solar plants to support heavy industry, the demand for which will be in Europe, not in the Middle East. So there is, I think the whole story on consumption and production in a way is being removed by the fact that clean energy is cheaper than dirty energy, particularly in the kind of high solar parts of the world like Chile or the Sahara. And that's changing the industrial competition landscape of the whole UNFCCC. Sometimes the policy discussion takes a while to catch up with the reality of the economics on the ground. That's one of those areas. I don't know if Camilla, you want to talk about the the energy crisis, and then we'll wrap up.
Yeah, well, just very quickly, just to say that I think in some respects, the energy crisis has actually masked some of the real world downward trend on coal that we will be seeing over the coming years. No new coal really is happening. I mean, our analysis shows that the 34 countries that are still home to proposed new coal power plants, 25 of these have seen a decline in their pre-construction pipeline since June 2021, and 9 of those countries have seen their entire proposed projects shelved or cancelled. So, you know, this is happening, and similarly, I think we're going to see a lot more rollout over the coming year or two on methodologies and around coal retirement mechanisms. So again, through the JETPs and other funding, that's certainly going to happen. Of course, the key issue will be China, and you know, China is now home to something like 66% of global capacity at pre-construction stages. And that's the really big nut to crack. Thanks.
Right. I think we, Alden, if you want to just quickly talk about low emissions, and then we'll wrap up.
Yeah, 2 points on low emissions. Clearly, the source of this was the Egyptian presidency, and I think it was the behest of some of the fossil fuel countries that I talked about earlier. It replaced language that talked about renewables and clean energy with the inclusion of low emissions. Now, there's some dispute whether low emissions is different than lower emissions. Lower emissions clearly would imply natural gas. Low emissions, I think, when you look at both carbon and methane, that doesn't meet the test, but that doesn't mean that they won't try to drive a truck through this loophole. I would just add on the earlier question, we really haven't talked about it, but there's a growing concern about trade frictions between some of the big players as a result of reshoring or friendshoring, as it's called, of critical minerals and material supply chains. Some of the provisions in the US Inflation Reduction Act have rankled not just China and India, but Korea, Japan, and Europe. And we're going to have to manage this friction so it doesn't get in the way of decarbonization. And obviously, if we're going to meet the expansion of critical minerals and materials needed to reach the 2030 decarbonization goal, which is about an 8-fold increase in some materials without sacrificing human rights and environmental standards, there's a lot of work to do in that space, but that probably should be the subject for a whole nother call.
Yes, I'm sure we'll get back to it. So thanks very much, people, for joining. And just finishing up, obviously, COP27 perhaps started more than it finished, and next year is going to be extraordinarily packed. From the spring meetings of the World Bank and the IMF, where we'll see massive focus on scaling up financing, to the promised summit on global systemic financial reform, which President Macron wants to hold, the Indian G20, where we will see the fight rejoined on fossil fuel phase out, but also the Major Economies Forum, which we're looking at building the clean energy systems and the breakthrough agendas. We'll have the UN Secretary General at the September UN General Assembly, bringing people together, and then coming back into UAE, where the year-long debate over design of the loss and damage fund will smash into the new financial goal discussions around who pays, who contributes, and who gets the money. Those are wrapped up. And at the same time, we will see trade disputes continuing on clean energy and who captures the clean economy. The JETPs and support for countries will carry on. So it's going to be, in many ways, the rubber hitting the road increasingly as we talk about money, trade, competitiveness, and who gets helped and who pays for that help. This is what the politics of delivery look like. It's not about setting targets, it's about delivering them and about who delivers them for whom. So that's our story of next year. We will try and do a briefing early next year, perhaps to put more detail on the rhythm of next year, but it's certainly not going to be a dull one. Thank you very much for joining this, and I hope you have a good week.